A warm welcome to all as we stop and reflect each day during Women's History Month on different issues that we want to amplify, and how important today that we have women CEOs from the financial investment advisory leadership speak and the data speak. So today, what a really critical roundtable co-hosted by the Investment Advisor Association with Karen Barr as president and CEO, who is a member of the Women Business Collaborative Advisory Council, with Laura Lutton, who is from Morningstar and really key to all this important research, to our friend Sarah Maynard, who's calling in from London to share the important data from CFA Institute, and the critical leadership of Alex Jung, who is on our WBC board of directors, on board and helped ran Oak Hill Investments in London for years, and someone we all admire. When we talk about so much good news, we have to stop with this industry and reflect. We have a long way to go and miles to go before we sleep to change the leadership. But that's not true of three women CEOs speaking today, which is our honor for having the CEOs of New York Life Investment Management, Franklin Templeton, and Russell Investments. As we stop at WBC and look at honoring more women CEOs, more women in the C-suite and investment managers, more women on corporate boards, and there's good news there. On public boards, we're averaging 40% a month for the last 5 months. Not such good news on private boards or capital boards. But with that, we've all got so much to learn today. So it is our honor to hear both the data and from the three role models. And we turn that over now to Alex Jung. Alex?
Thank you, Edie. Welcome, everybody. I share Edie's sentiments. This topic is very near and dear to my heart, having spent 25 to 30 years as a partner and investor across alternatives, in a place where you'll see in the data, we have a lot, even more room to go. All of us here on this call share the importance of data and measurement, and that progress and accountability really can't happen until we have the real data sets. And I'm honored to set the table here with a discussion around some great work done by both Morningstar and CFA around really trying to get to the heart of where the industry is today and how it has evolved. And then we're going to hand it off to a great discussion with three leaders and I would call luminaries in our industry. So I'm excited about that. Laura Lutton is here from Morningstar. She heads asset management solutions, also having been a director in North American research, and Sarah Maynard from the CFA, who's now global head of external inclusivity and diversity. I hope I got that title right, Sarah. Also a former analyst, fund manager, and has been in roles such as head of stewardship at a global equity firm. Both of them have great and very unique data sets to talk about. And I think, the first thing I'd like to do is congratulate you both for really leading that charge. And particularly, we'll start with Laura. The report that you guys came out with was a really interesting, both historical view as well as really seeing where the numbers are today. Could you just give the audience just a one line on exactly what data set you're talking about, what part of the investment management industry, to make sure we're all on the right playing field here? And then there's a big headline and key takeaway on where we are today, and share it with us, so I don't take your shine there.
Thanks, Alex. It's great to be here with all of you today. Thanks for including me and Morningstar. We did update a study just Tuesday highlighting data on registered mutual fund managers. So Morningstar collects data on mutual funds globally, tens of thousands of securities, and these are all registered with regulators. So we know who the named managers are of these funds. In many cases, those managers tell us their gender. And in cases where they don't, our quant team uses an algorithm to estimate the gender. And that gives us a great global scope. And it helps us track trends over time, like how often women are mutual fund managers globally. And the slide that you can see in front of you is the bad news that you alluded to, Alex, which is the rate of women mutual fund managers globally is relatively unchanged since 2000. We're holding at about 14%. There is a little bit of good news though on the next slide, which is there are some regions where we are seeing higher representation of women in parts of Asia like China, Singapore, South Korea, and Hong Kong. We have rates of women mutual fund managers north of 20%, almost 30% in China. But then in some Western markets where our industry's very well established, UK, United States, Germany, we are below that global average of 14%. And on the next slide here, you'll see there's a little bit of a difference by asset class. So if you are a fixed income fund manager, you're slightly more likely to be a woman than if you're running a stock fund or an allocation fund. You'll note the rate of women managers and allocation strategies has ticked up slightly. That's the blue line on the slide that you're seeing. That's an area of growth in the industry, particularly in recent years. And I would note that in those countries where we saw higher rates of women managers, like parts of Asia, that's another area of the world where our industry is growing quickly. So where we see growth, we often see better opportunities for women, but clearly we've got a long way to go to parity.
It's really stunning to us to see that geographical difference and how stark it is. Is there anything in the data or the next time that you're going to be collecting the data where you're going to try to pull that apart and create a narrative around that, or some learnings for the firms that are obviously running international businesses or just US firms for that matter?
Yeah, so we're really good at knowing what the data is today. We have less transparency into why it is what it is. I think that we've got some cultural differences in different parts of the world that are perhaps driving more women towards careers in financial services and leadership roles in money management. But I think there are other organizations like the CFA. Sarah is going to show us some data as well that may help tease that answer out as well.
Yeah, and I think it's a great leeway, because part of this is really building the pipeline there's some time and pipeline growth that needs to happen to get those numbers up, as we know, and the CFA is an important part of a career trajectory to really understand how that pipeline is growing. So Sarah, over to you. What do you want to start with here in highlighting how gender is looking in your CFA candidates and the kind of graduates?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's a great pleasure. So if I should bring up one of the slide deck that I shared, then this particular one is the snapshot, and it's very similar, of course, to the Morningstar data, as you might expect. So the red arrow reflects where the US is in terms of global perspective, but everywhere in the world, essentially women are underrepresented in the industry relative to the workforce as a whole. However, if we move on to the next slide, and then we can see essentially something is starting to happen in terms of our candidate gender development. And so while, as Laura's indicated, the numbers around our membership have been quite stubborn so far, the great thing is if you look at the pipeline in terms of that candidate gender trend, you can see something really different going on. And that's a real point of encouragement. If we drill into the next slide and we look at where our growth markets are, then you can see way out in front is China. And what we found really interesting in terms of surveying our membership so that we understand what's actually happening in those markets and why folks are deciding to enter the industry, what we see in China is the culture really says this is an industry for women. So they aren't shackled to the sense of there being white male role models that perhaps do not speak of inclusivity in the way that what tends to project in the US and in the UK markets and some others. But even there, even if I look at the developed markets where we've been established for a long time, there are just little indications of growth. So where historically the growth in women membership has lagged male, it's now really starting to pick up. And as I say, there's some other areas of the markets where we're seeing some big improvements, and the slide slipped a bit, but there's some encouraging data in places like South Africa, where gender diversity is a huge issue, but nonetheless they see this industry as attractive. So to the pipeline point, it is possible to frame this industry in a way that is attractive to young women coming in.
It is great to see that entry point getting to a place, because we have to increase the pipe. One of the things that we spent a lot of time on in our business is really talking about the mid-level. They have their CFAs, but they're not quite portfolio managers. And there's this mid-level, and you did some interesting mid-level and this attrition that we were seeing. Kind of they're getting in the industry, but we're not retaining them for various number of reasons. A lot of data has shown leadership, role modeling and things like that, but there's also some work you did around inflection points in people's career, as well as the roles people choose when they have their CFA, rather than going into portfolio management roles, going into roles that don't quite lead to actually allocating capital and investing. Can you just highlight two of those things and help us all be aware of what we should be watching for there?
Sure. So I think there's a sort of confluence of a number of factors here. So women have put this big investment in getting their CFA. However, what we know is that typically they're getting their charter around the age of 31. And there is something about data that we see across a great many markets which suggests that's the point at which women start to think about work-life balance. They may think about having a family, although there's also some interesting Oliver Wyman data that tends to suggest that those are not the main reasons. And in fact, yesterday I was doing a panel, South American one, and there were some great market heads for some very large businesses who were women. So that's certainly not a kind of excuse, if you like, I'd want to lean on. So essentially what we see is around that kind of age group, women are perhaps making decisions and not going down that analyst to PM role that you might have expected and traditionally men choose. So they might be moving to to a risk analyst, to performance management. They may be even going into support and sales type roles, even though they've got their CFA and are well able really to progress into running funds. So I think there is a lot that firms should be doing to really stop that pipeline, which is almost like an internal leak, as well as those who actually choose to step away from the industry, because otherwise, the business is going to be really missing out on those individuals.
Yeah, I like to call it one of the most undervalued asset classes in our financial markets today. One of the things we all talked about is this is a great start for a data set, and transparency has been something as an industry everybody is struggling to get to. This is reported data that is great, but we have another, and we have another part of investment management. Alternatives is a $17 trillion market, growing to be almost in same size as the mutual fund market over time, and there's no data and there's no transparency. What do you think the next step is for everybody that's on the call today on how we can collaborate and work to get a fuller data set across our whole industry? Maybe I'll start with Laura on that, and then we can wrap up and send it over to Karen.
So you're absolutely right, Alex, that we're seeing an increasing number of assets going into these types of investments that are not publicly listed. So we don't have the same transparency that we would around a mutual fund. So I think we're going to have to get creative in terms of how we count in those parts of the market. Ask for the data and start to track it in a central place. And I know there are some organizations that are working on that now. And I think as leaders in the industry, we can all help with that transparency, because I think it's important to have a benchmark and to be able to track our progress as a group.
Great. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
I would say we have some of that data because we do actually have, some members who are in those asset classes. So I think the onus is on us to sort of follow that up. The other big piece, of course, is client demand, because we're seeing clients asking for that data. And the more they do that, then, they're the folks that, anyone who's running a business is going to have their mind on. So that's a great pressure point.
Yeah, and one of the things the WBC is really excited about is pooling together all the great finance organizations that we all work with to try to pool that data together, because we all have various aspects. So stay tuned for that one. I love the conversation. We can go many minutes longer on this, but I encourage everybody to go to the websites of both Morningstar and CFA to have the detail behind the reports that we've been referring to. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Karen to lead our next discussion. Thanks very much, Laura and Sarah. Look forward to continuing our work together.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Laura and Sarah, for sharing that critically important data. As we know, it's just a start. There's way more to go, but it's critically important work. It is now my pleasure to introduce our CEO panel. I'm honored to be joined by three inspiring leaders of asset management firms, indeed, as Alex noted, luminaries. Jenny Johnson is president and CEO of Franklin Templeton, a global investment management firm managing $1.5 trillion in assets. Yie-Hsin is CEO of New York Life Investment Management, New York Life's $380 billion, global multi-boutique third-party asset management business. Michelle Seitz is chairman and CEO of Russell Investments, a leading global investment solutions partner with $323 billion AUM and $2.5 trillion under advisement. Jenny, Yie-Hsin, and Michelle have a combined 85 plus years of experience in asset management, and they oversee a combined $4.5 trillion in assets. They have all been named to various lists of the most influential and powerful women in finance, and I would just say most powerful and influential in finance, and have won numerous accolades. They're passionate about diversity and inclusion in corporate culture, and they're among just a handful of women at the top of asset management firms, which brings us back to the data. Michelle, as we've just heard, the data around gender diversity in the investment industry has barely budged over the past several years. Why do you think that is, and what will it take to see real progress here?
Yeah, well, number one, thank you very much for having me, and it's a privilege to be on a panel with my co-CEOs and friends of mine. So we certainly want to engage the industry on this dialogue, and are very excited, and our firms are very committed to doing it. Karen, I think we just depicted lots of different ways that we can pull various levers to make a difference on the industry. The one that I'm critically focused on, and have been for a while, though, is the one about, I think what the former panelist called it was the internal leak. We have the women taking the exams. We have the women graduating from the most esteemed universities and colleges around the world. We have qualified candidates already. So we're all doing things in high schools and colleges, et cetera. We get them interested. They wouldn't take the most grueling exam on the face of the earth called the CFA if they weren't already intrigued and interested in our industry. But what we need to make sure of is that once they get within our pipe, that we include them on fast tracks to have significant leadership roles within the industry. And those reside in all kinds of different shapes and forms, but typically for the C-suite, as well as for the higher echelons of compensation and significance and impact within investment firms, you need to be in the investment field or senior level of sales and client service field. And so I think the numbers that always strike me as being disappointing are making sure that we attract and retain people once they're in the fold, to make sure that they're on the analyst track, the portfolio management track, the senior leadership track, of managing P&L. And so that to me is the critical element. And I think there often is confusion about what those roles entail, about the what needs to be done and how much control you have over how you'll do it. But I think our focus needs to be on the inclusion part and getting them on the track to ensure that they have the level of impact that their male CFA counterparts have within an organization once they get on board.
Thank you, Michelle. I know, Jenny, you have some views on the data too. I want to ask you to chime in.
Well, again, thank you for including me on this panel with my friends. It's kind of fun. To me, on the DE&I question, you have to come at it and thinking of it as just an unbelievable opportunity, right? So, I look at it as a growth story, which is if there's been this underutilized group of talented people, right? Wow, if you could be the one to figure out how to hire them and bring them in, what an amazing opportunity that is. And I think it's the same thing from an investment standpoint. When you look at, venture capital money, I used to say, oh, only 2.9% of VC money went to women. And we've done all this work. And guess what, guys? Last year, it was less than 2% went to female entrepreneurs. So I look at that and say, that's got to be a diamond in the rough as far as investment opportunity. The crowded trade is the white male entrepreneur, right? So now you can go figure out and be the contrarian. So if you address this issue from an opportunity, I think Michelle said it absolutely right. It's about, attracting people and you have to start kind of at a grassroots. What are the things that are attracting people? And as we all look at our own recruiting, I always say if you fish in the same pond, you catch the same fish. So what are you doing to be able to expand the universe of candidates, bringing them in, and then, honestly measuring how you do as a firm in retaining people, honestly measuring how you do as a firm in promoting people. And I think that we as asset managers and our clients are starting to demand more transparency around the data. And the data doesn't always look good, but you're not going to improve it unless you honestly measure it and put a stake in the ground and then are committed to figuring out ways to improve it.
Yie-Hsin, what is your take on the data?
Well, I too wanted to say I'm delighted to be here with Jenny and Michelle. Karen, thank you for this, to the WBC, IAA, and Morningstar too. So, we're focused around good data, and I think that's critically important because without it, you can't measure progress, you can't hold managements and companies accountable, but just as importantly is the insights that the data provides that helps inform your DE&I strategy and the programs you can develop within your own companies. So for example, for us, one very important source of data internally is our annual employee surveys. It gives us insight into the state of our workforce, the level of employee engagement, which in many ways is trying to measure these intrinsic feelings of belonging and purpose, words that we often attribute to degree of inclusivity. And we'll compare our results against industry benchmarks over the course of time, across many different demographic dimensions. And where we see disparities relative to representation, it gives us an opportunity to dig deeper, to try to understand why that is, whether we need to do more pulse surveys or focus groups to then develop programming that's much more on target. We also look at external data. So I love hearing the work that Morningstar and CFA has done. For instance, back in 2017, we partnered with the Center for Talent Innovation to focus on a study around easing racial tensions at work. And what we found was a really striking finding that there is a tremendous lack of diversity in social networks across America, regardless of your race. And what that led us to conclude is that our workplace, where people come to work every day, is oftentimes their most diverse community. And so it's with that data-driven insight that led us to develop a program called Coming Together, Candid Conversations About Race, that were just incredibly powerful as we heard individual stories. And then since then, we've seen our scores along DE&I dimensions increase 15% favorably relative to benchmark. And we're now at a position where we have really good data within our organization on gender and race. And we're increasingly seeking of our new employees, asking them to self-identify if they're members of the LGBTQ plus community, or they're a veteran or disabled. And we're seeing meaningful increases in representation, which of course helps inform the insights that we can get from information, but it also speaks to the level of comfort people have in expressing their identity. So at the end of the day, I agree with what my co-panelists have said. I mean, there's a huge opportunity here, and we do need data to drive that process, but it's also the insights that we can glean, and very importantly, what we do with that data that I think can make the difference.
Thank you. And I know you all touched on some of what you're doing at your firms, but beyond the data, I think our audience would love to hear more about the programs that you've put in place, more broadly beyond recruitment, but what are the programs involving inclusion and equity? Jenny, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so one of the first actions I did is when I became CEO was sign the CEO pledge for diversity and inclusion, and then actually hired a chief DE&I officer reporting directly to me, and she's great, Regina Curry, and she keeps me accountable by our one-on-ones. We're right now probably averaging them weekly, and so it makes sure that the topic's on the forefront of my mind. And one of the first things she did was really go out and do an assessment in the firm, right? So what is the true experience of folks? What are the true numbers that we have? And then now we're working through what are the goals that we're going to make. And, like one of the things we're talking about is every employee have some D&I goal that they have to achieve. Everybody in the firm, all 10,000 employees, that they will be, it'll be part of their performance review. And then the other things is as we have these 6 business resource groups are really grassroots, LGBTQ, veterans, women, the Black Empowerment Network, OLA, our Hispanic one, and actually spending time with them, talking to them about their real experience within the firm. And part of it, I think, as leaders is kind of listening to what's happening and making it a safe place to be able to have honest conversations. So that's kind of within the firm, and that's the retention. We're also doing some interesting things. We just supported a group that is focused on historically Black and colleges and universities, and we do programs like Girls Who Invest, and we do those things, and they provide internships in summer. Is that you want these groups that have been historically underrepresented to experience working in your firm, so in the industry, so then they can relate and see themselves as being in it, right? It's hard. I mean, our HR department will say, we just don't get as many women as we do men who apply right out of college. Well, we got to start addressing that sourcing problem earlier. And I think there are things that we can do about that. But so for us, I would say it's as much of assessment, putting stakes in the ground of how we're going to improve it, going public with what our numbers are so that we're held accountable, and then really listening to our employees to understand the experience.
Thank you, Jenny. That is tremendous. Michelle, I know you were hired. Actually, one of the reasons was to enhance the corporate culture at Russell. Can you share what you have been doing on inclusion and equity when folks are hired at your firm?
Yeah. Well, number one, I think that at least I'll speak for myself. I tend to trust that people's intentions are right placed, right? So, and the question is, what do you need to do differently if you're getting the same bad answer, right? And so that's really what we have focused on. And I do believe that culturally, Russell Investments has had all the best intentions, but sometimes that doesn't lead to the right results. And so you have to keep asking the question. So I think my friends here have said the same thing, which is you just need to listen and try different things until you hit the right goals and the right metrics, just like you would for any goal that you have in a business. Is you measure it, you course correct, and you keep trying over and over again, and you don't give up. And so in that vein, I mean, certainly we solidified many things that came, I think, as part of the culture. We solidified them. So for instance, in addition to many of the things that Jenny said, we have associate resource groups as well. And the key that we made different was in our scorecards. we do have specific line items for D&I metrics for all of our managers. We do have more metrics now around ensuring that we have a diverse slate of qualified candidates for every job opening that there is, even if that takes us a little bit longer, which it sometimes does. And so we do have those things in place now. We certainly have been much more structured, and we've institutionalized the engagement that we have and the sponsorship that we have. So we have many of which I am a direct executive sponsor of the Black Associate Resource Group. And we just launched with them at the center a reverse mentoring program, as well as a sponsoring program that every executive at the firm, you know, those that are direct reports to me, and I too took on sponsors and mentees. And so we're just trying to make sure that we speak from the top down and have direct engagement, and then operationalize these metrics as part of how we actually manage the business. And we course correct when the data doesn't prove that the actions we're taking are having the outcomes that we want. And I think that's the key, is we just have to keep recalibrating until we find the ways that do hit the right metrics to get the outcomes and a more diverse slate of candidates within all these roles. And when I think of diversity, I think about it clearly gender, but it's diversity more broadly. And so this isn't an anti-men exercise. This is all about harnessing all the power that we all have, all of the capabilities, the styles, the ethnic backgrounds that we all have, and making sure that everyone feels the intentionality of the senior leaders to make a difference and make sure that we're making the most of the talent that we're able to attract to our firms.
That's terrific, Michelle. And as you point out, the tone has to come from the top, right? The top down. I know, Yie-Hsin, we've talked about this a little in the prep. What do you think needs to happen to accelerate more women into the type of leadership role that you all have now?
You know, we, like Jenny and Michelle, you know, really believe that you have to resource this effort like you would any major strategic initiative, with commitment from the absolute top, but also embed it into every single process you have around talent. So similar to Russell and Franklin, this has been something we've been committed to for a long time. We've had an Office of Diversity and Inclusion now. We set that up back in 2006, a Chief Diversity Officer. We have employee networking groups, as many organizations do, and a lot of external partnerships where we leverage them for talent acquisition and talent development. And in fact, 2/3 of our employees regularly attend at least one event each year. And what we're encouraging is for people to attend events in groups that are not actually aligned with that focus, so they understand what it feels like to be in the minority. And of course, we regularly collect, review, and measure our progress. But fundamentally, we believe that in order to change the outcome, we have to change our processes. And so Michelle talked about this on the talent acquisition front, right? We insist on diverse slate of candidates, not just one woman and a minority, but two, because the research shows that you are dramatically more likely to hire a person with a diverse background, or a woman if that's the case. Same thing with diverse interviewers, to try to minimize that unconscious bias. And we train our people on behavioral-based interviewing, focusing less on experiential questions, but much more on situational ones. And like Michelle, I mean, we've seen for open positions, you know, we get a predominance of men applying versus women. So we've even gone so far as to scrub our job descriptions, looking for unconscious bias. On the talent management front, that's another critical area. You know, you think about promotions. So we don't just focus on the most senior levels. We'll look at promotion candidates across the entirety of the spectrum. And wherever we see candidates not at representation, it causes us to ask the question, well, is that right? You know, and should this person be here that isn't there? Well, if not, then what do we need to develop this person? Who's their sponsor? What's their next opportunity? And one step we recently took was to name our Chief Diversity Officer as head of talent management. And so what we've done is now integrated DEI into the development and investment that we're making in our people. So, you know, for all of us, I mean, it's clear we have to have the goal, we have to have the senior intent and focus and willingness to keep trying different things and seeing what works. But it is also, I think, being very methodical, looking at every step around our talent that I think will ultimately shape the pipeline and increase the likelihood that we'll achieve the outcome that all of us want to see.
Thank you. And you touched on a very important point, and Jenny, you touched on it too, how to attract more women to our industry generally. We hear that a lot from our members who are all investment advisors, lamenting how few women apply for investment roles. How do we make this industry more attractive to women, and particularly women of color? And I know we're getting some comments in the chat, and I hear this too from the next generation. Our industry sometimes does not sound mission driven, and that might be a factor as well. How do we address these issues and attract more women to our industry? Jenny, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'd love that one, because the light bulb went on for me when I was asking my daughters whether any of them would follow me. I have 3 daughters in the business, and one of my daughters is, I want to do something that helps people. And I was like, are you kidding me? This business helps people. This is a business where, we help people achieve the most important goals of their lives. Talk to somebody who's going to lose their home in retirement. You'll see fear. Talk to somebody who has a special needs child and they're worried about whether there's enough money saved to take care of them. This is a very mission driven business. And then I talk about kind of recently, just think about, you've had this world in COVID and we needed a vaccine. It's the Pfizers and the Modernas and the J&Js that came up. Oh, by the way, they're owned by mutual fund holders and pensions, teachers and firemen, right? It's those guys who have deployed capital to improve all of our lives. And I think we do a poor job as an industry actually connecting the dots for people on really not only how mission driven this business is, but also how the companies that we invest in, the ones that are sustainable and good and look for upside, often have a mission in their own that are really powerful. As you can see, I'm very passionate on that particular topic.
Michelle, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I would just say giant exclamation point. If I could blanket the airwaves of what our purpose is, our purpose is to appropriately allocate capital to companies that actually add to society and create jobs. And with the overlay of sustainable investing and ESG, that couldn't be more critical. We are at the epicenter of ensuring that our system is inclusive, the capitalistic system is inclusive, and that we are funding enterprises that can create opportunity for all. And so I think we're right at the tip of the spear. That doesn't even mention what Jenny just said, and the purpose of Russell Investments is to enable for people's financial security. So what we do with the savings, I just talked about what we do with our investing side, but what we do with our savings is fund the retirement needs, the dignity, and the longevity lifestyles of everyone around the globe. Whether you participate in an IRA or you participate in a defined contribution or a defined pension plan, defined benefit plan. Again, our clients are teachers, government workers, hospital workers. It's around the globe. And so at the core of what we do is to provide for people's financial security and for economic expansion. And I agree that story is not told. It's been so drowned out with beating benchmarks and making money that is so ancillary and so compartmentalized to what this industry actually exists to do. And is the quicker we get back there, the better off the entire industry will be.
Yie-Hsin, I know you feel strongly on this issue as well.
I do too. I join with the passion that Jenny and Michelle have. And, I was thinking about this question just in terms of young women, right? Like the questions they ask themselves when they think about what career path to take are probably not all that different from the ones we ask ourselves, right? Like number one, like what am I good at? I think we would all agree there's plenty of young women out there that have everything necessary to be successful in our business. And then number two, what am I interested in? And I think this is what Jenny and Michelle were talking about, making a difference in the lives of people and families around me. You know, I remember our having done some research around women investors and realizing that women are 40% less invested than men. We live longer, but you know, we're not really realizing our full potential. And so as we were rolling out this research, I held a number of dinners across the country with financial advisors. And I remember one in particular, she said, you know, she was one of 6 kids. She was raised by a single mom that held down 2 jobs. Her dad left way long ago. And she vowed to herself that she would get so expert at finance to not find herself in that situation so she could take care of her mother and all the women like her. And today she's one of the most successful financial advisors. I mean, that's a really powerful way to make a difference. I think the hard part of this is when women ask the question, can I make a long-term career out of this? And I think this is where the numbers don't work in our favor, right? We know women represent half the population of financial services, but then when you look at the top, it's only 20% representation. And so they look at that success rate versus other industries. And frankly, I think this is where we come in, right? This is a passionate group of women here to support one another. We are wanting to help the generation behind us. And I think the onus is on us to really tell it like it is, to lessen that burden of feeling like you're alone and figuring this out by yourself. You know, I mean, you could ask any one of us, you know, how did we get here? And sure, we could talk about the hard work and our willingness to speak up and take whatever opportunity. But I think what is much more valuable to people is when we share our failures and our struggles and why we keep getting up when we get knocked down. So I truly think, you know, us taking this mindset of being in this together, you know, really embracing one another, honestly, candidly, I think we can begin to connect what everyone's been saying in terms of the good we do and really tapping into our next generation.
Beautifully, beautifully said. And I know I have that conversation in my household too, connecting all these dots. It's really important to tell the story of what our industry does in the inspiring way that all 3 of you have done so. Again, picking up on some of the threads that have been raised and maybe inflection points, the challenge of the perceptions of our industry and raising a family. And you are all mothers. Michelle, why don't we start with you? I mean, personally, I've grown to not like the phrase balance, work-life balance, but I would love to hear, you know, how you've managed, what advice you give to women, how we can change the perceptions. You have 5 children, words of wisdom.
Yeah, so I think all parents, especially in the generation that we're in now and our children's generations, this applies to everyone, not just women. I understand that there are unique challenges from a societal standpoint for women in particular, and then we have the physical demands as well of childbearing. But I would just say that I have this conversation as much with my male colleagues, and I have for quite some time, as much as, and both my sons and my daughters. I think it's all about prioritization, and certainly you will be consumed with life, whether it's your work life or it's your family life or it's your spousal life or it's your personal life. Things happen in life. And so this idea of some kind of grand perfect balance at all time, I think really sets us up for failure. The reality of life is there is no balance perfectly at any given point in time, but you have to prioritize correctly in order to make sure that you are mentally healthy and physically healthy over time. And I would simply say that you're much more able to do things than I think our societal narrative would lend itself to believe that you could. So I think the most powerful thing I could say is that I certainly have lots of stories along the way, but one that I'll tell in particular was 2001 My child was born in 2000. I was walking him in my fingers around my condo, and I was surrounded by the executive team at the firm I was working with. We were talking about succession planning, and they all looked at me and said, "Would you be willing to take over as the CEO?" And I said, "Sure, but I have other priorities at the moment right now too," as I walked around my little 1-year-old around the floor. And frankly, I thought that took me out of the running. It clearly did not. So, and I took over as CEO in the summer of 2001 when he was 18 months old, and I followed with another child in 2002, et cetera, et cetera. And so I guess my bottom line would be that there have been lots of examples over time when the belief was you can't possibly get pregnant yet again, you can't possibly have 5 kids, you can't possibly move across the country from Chicago to Seattle with high school girls, you can't possibly, et cetera, et cetera. And the answer is yes, you can. Yes, you can. As long as you know yourself, as long as you know your family, as long as you know how to manage it. I mean, we are incredibly adaptive people. And as long as employers, as long as executives tell you what needs to be done, but they allow you to figure out how you're going to get it done, I think that's been by far the most critical thing for me personally, but also for me as an executive to empower all of my associates and colleagues with is you need to know what needs to get done, but it's up to you to figure out how you get it done. And I think allowing for that flexibility is key to being able to accommodate everyone's prioritization of different facets of their life over the course of their long career.
Jenny, anything to add on that point?
I'm not sure there's much to add other than I feel fortunate because I'm a second generation guilty mom. My mother had 7 children and went back to college and graduated from Stanford Medical School when only 5% of the graduates were women. And so I'm actually an underachiever with my 5 children in my family of women. But no, as Michelle said, I think the employers of choice are the employers who remember it is a marathon, not a sprint. And in a marathon, sometimes you got to take a little rest. Maybe your home life pulls up a little bit more and work's got to accommodate, or maybe sometimes work takes a little bit more and your family ends up accommodating. And just making sure that you're always thinking through what your own personal priorities are and not to lose sight of those in the process. And I think the good employers understand that's the situation. And it goes, I think, where men leaders can really be valuable here is that be a leader and say, you know what, I need to leave today the office because I'm going to take my daughter, I'm coaching her soccer team, or I'm going to take my son to the doctor, right? And so the stigma can't be that it's just that companies have to accommodate women because they have those responsibilities, but that we all share those responsibilities. And I know great dads love to be able to participate in those types of things. So I think we could, from a retention standpoint, a little bit more of that would be very useful.
Yie-Hsin, would you like to weigh in there as well, both from and from any perspective, right? As someone who got to where you are, but also as an employer.
I mean, it's hard to add too much more to what Jenny and Michelle said. I mean, I completely agree around prioritization and balance over time. I think for me, I've also learned to say no much more than I used to. And I would also say it's really important to build a village. I didn't realize that, I think, early on in my career. I kind of thought I just needed to, carry the heavy backpack by myself. But the moment that I started to ask for help and created a group of people around me, both in the company and outside the company, is really what, made it all possible.
So, and let me pick up there. There are a few things in the chat about flexibility. There's some job shares and maternity leave, and as an employer, what are some of the ways? And I think we've seen this in this pandemic. People became way more flexible than they thought they were, and why why should we go back to not being flexible in some cases? Yie-Hsin, do you have views on flexibility in the workplace and how that can attract young women to our, or any women to our industry?
I mean, I think it applies to everybody. I think what we've seen through the pandemic is, first off, as an industry, we've been able to move to a remote work environment very quickly and without losing a beat. In many ways, I think what we have found is that people are incredibly productive. And as we survey our employees, as we think about return to work, I mean, people clearly are missing the collaboration, the opportunity to interact with each other and brainstorm. And we do want to be an on-premise employer, but at the same time, we recognize that there are a lot of pressures, especially with women. I mean, we've seen the data over the course of this year that women have disproportionately been impacted by the pandemic, whether it's from homeschooling or childcare or elder care. And I think being cognizant of that, and I think what's going to happen as we move forward, as we all kind of navigate this new environment of increased flexibility across the board, is that the norm of everybody shows up at the office Monday through Friday, they have to put in their hours there. Like, that's not the case anymore. There's more power in the hands of our employees. And I think that is a good move. And so I think that level of flexibility and understanding what people need is a way that we become, really great employers. And this is across the board, because for every one situation, we know there are hundreds of different individual circumstances, and being mindful of all of that, I think, is really important.
Can I, Karen, just throw one thing into that? I just had a thought. I was thinking about this recently about like our call center. So our call center, it used to be you had to come in, COVID happens, everybody's working from home. My goodness, it's working incredibly well. And I was just thinking about, if you think for women having flexibility, and again, for parents in general, having flexibility, I was like, why couldn't we just have it where you could sign up for your hours in a day in a call center? You got to take your kids to the doctor from 2 to 3:30. And yeah, there could only be so many slots that are missing, that people can be out. So maybe you don't get there quickly enough and you're not going to have that flexibility. But if we can break down jobs to being realistic about when the timing that they have to be done and leverage technology, you're going to really allow people to be much more successful at this integration of work and life and be able to cover more of their priorities.
Thank you. I think we have time for one lightning question, and that is, what would you challenge today's audience in our industry to do? Your call to action from here. Yie-Hsin, let's start with you.
Well, I go back to my point about telling our stories, being more vulnerable. I think in order to make our industry more inviting to women, we need to take off our heavy coat of armor, this beautiful protective armor that we've been carrying, and really show our hearts. That way, I think we will make our industry increasingly female. I think the other thing I would say is that, whether it's from a company perspective or an individual perspective, I think there's a couple things we really have to focus in on is developing our talent, right? Giving women critical assignments so they can really grow, and for women themselves to view mistakes as learning opportunities. Number 2, getting sponsors, right? Making sure that you have somebody in your corner who's giving you honest feedback, career advice, and helping you map out your career. And then really working hard at giving women opportunities so they can prove their worth. I was fortunate enough to have a couple people in my life that ended up giving me the opportunities that I have. And I think for women themselves, when they think about that, it's really about coming through on your commitments, delivering results so that you get the confidence of people in positions that can open those doors for you to give you that opportunity.
Beautifully said. Michelle, over to you.
Well, it's hard to follow this esteemed group. So many things have been said. I guess I would just emphasize that embrace the possible prototype, and absolutely agree with Yie-Hsin. And that is that embracing sponsors and senior executives, male, female, embracing all people to bring them along. Sponsorship is so critically important that I think these women sessions allow people to see the vulnerability, the humanity, the inclusion, the sense of belonging, but it has to be inclusive of all people in power, not just other women. So that sponsorship and reaching out for that sponsorship is incumbent upon everyone. So I would just broaden the network, make sure that we embrace the possible, make sure that we prototype our way to success, not sticking with programs that don't lead to success 3 years later, and then we scratch our heads asking, wonder why the numbers haven't moved, because we didn't pivot quickly enough. We just need to keep asking the question, trying different things, and it's a two-way street. We as leaders need to make sure that the metrics say that we're successful, and then we as participants, we as women, also need to speak up and say what it is we need in order to be successful and have the impact that we want to have.
Thank you. Jenny, your call to action?
I'll be quick. I totally agree with Yie-Hsin and Michelle said, and just adding to it. Like early in my career, I was all about work and my family because I was, busy raising the 5 kids. Now that they're older, I'm a natural introvert who had to learn to be an extrovert. I took the risk and reached out to Michelle and invited her to something, and have started to build my network of friends in the industry. They become friends, and they have challenged me at times. They have been my greatest allies when I need to talk through something. So being bold and fearless in reaching out, and the worst thing somebody can say is, no, I'm sorry, I'm too busy, I don't have time for you. But you'll get so much value out of that network.
We will always make time for you, Jenny. And everybody on this.
I mean?
Yeah, and I would just say, I speak for all of us, everybody on this call, there is never someone that I turn down that earnestly wants to have an impact on society and on financial services. I mean, I think all of us, struggle with how many times we do that, but almost always someone's going to say yes. So I agree.
Thank you. Thank you for an incredible session. Jenny, Yie-Hsin, Michelle, this was amazing. Very much appreciate your strong and powerful leadership on DE&I and all asset management issues. So thank you so much. A big shout out to the WBC for accelerating the change we need. And back over to you, Alex.
Well, thank you, Karen. Thank you all. I mean, if there's one thing that we've learned from this session is how it's important to learn from each other and leverage each other's best practices, and support support each other. And the WBC is over 40 organizations that have a shared mission of really driving and accelerating change. And I think I agree, our industry is so fundamental in driving that change, and your leadership and the creativity that you have involved your organizations in terms of strategic thinking to solve this problem and change the way the industry has worked is great food for thought for the rest of us on this call. So thank you to Morningstar and the CFA and Karen and the great leaders on the call. And we look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. As what great comments of all 3 of you as leaders, Karen, Alex, really, and to Laura and to Sarah. It's really, we have pages that we want to share of all the whys. And I think when you just said, Yie-Hsin, when you said, take off our armor and show our hearts as well as the talent, et cetera, but so many of you, just thank you. As Alex just said, you are change leaders. You will change the industry.